Hey guys, it's Mystic Rain here, and today I'm going to be giving you a list of 5 tarot decks that are really good for beginners to start working with. So one thing I've learned and I've noticed about these videos that people put out about beginners deck is that they have a tendency to put out very indie decks, very kind of modern decks that are a little bit more expensive, that doesn't necessarily meet everyone's price points, that are trending at that time and are not necessarily mainstays of the tarot tradition. And I'm trying to go a completely different route. I'm trying to give you your fundamental deck. So your deck that is supposed to stay with you for the duration of your tarot journey, and decks that I feel like are a fair price point. So cheap decks that I feel like you can get your worth out of in terms of learning it, and the fact that it has enough information for you and enough symbols that are in its imagery for you to actually learn with, okay? So let's just jump right in. I feel like we don't need that big of an introduction. So the first deck that I feel like needs to be in every beginner's repertoire is the Rider-Waite deck, okay? I feel like the Rider-Waite deck is an absolute non-negotiable. The reason why I feel like the Rider-Waite deck is a non-negotiable is because the majority of every other deck that you will find in the market is built off of the Rider-Waite deck. A lot of decks are reprints. A lot of deck takes the imagery from the Rider-Waite deck and then it makes its own deck. If you can read the Rider-Waite deck, you can read any deck that's ever put in front of you, ever. Okay, so there are numerous editions of the Rider-Waite deck. I don't think it matters which edition that you get. I personally have 2 editions of the Rider-Waite deck. I'll show you what they both look like side by side. I also have a number of reprints of the Rider-Waite deck. I'm not going to show you any of the reprints of the Rider-Waite deck because honestly, I'm not entirely sure whether or not it's copyrighted or not, so I'm not going to actually show those to you. But this is a version of the Rider-Waite deck called the Smith-Waite Centennial Edition. There's tons of them. It really doesn't matter which one you get, as long as it says Rider-Waite on it. The reason for that is because the symbols and the pictures in all of these decks are exactly the same. You will see that the color scheme changes a little bit in terms of the vibrancy of each color, but this is the traditional deck. When you think of tarot, this is what people are talking about. When you imagine tarot in your head, they are talking about this deck right here. They are talking about the Rider-Waite deck. This is the tarot deck. This is the deck that all of the meanings of all these modern decks that you see out on the market, this is where it comes from. This is where it derives from. It derives from the Rider-Waite deck. Now on Amazon, they're about 20 bucks. And so I know for some people this can be quite the investment, but it is the deck that you should have. In my opinion, it should be your starting deck, your home deck. Anyone that has really properly studied the Rider-Waite deck notices that there are so many books that are written on the Rider-Waite deck, and a lot of them are in Old English, right? Like really hard to read, really hard to decipher. It's like you're reading a whole different language, very, very boring. But lucky enough, there are so many books on the market, beginner books like How to Read Tarot, Reading Tarot for the First Time, Tarot for Dummies. That's a thing. I've got it right here. Tarot for Dummies is a thing. It's all based off of this deck. The majority of books that you buy about tarot and its definitions are based off of this deck. So I think everyone should start with this one. Now, it doesn't matter, again, it doesn't matter, in my opinion, which version you get, as long as you're getting and starting with a Rider-Waite tarot deck. Now, if the tarot deck doesn't speak to you aesthetically, maybe you don't find it pleasing, I would suggest that you get a deck that you find pleasing, that calls to you, and then you also get the Rider-Waite, and then as you're learning the tarot, you compare them side by side, because your Rider-Waite is your actual fundamental deck. It is most likely the new deck that you have that you think is prettier, most likely that deck is based off of the Rider-Waite deck, so you should have it in your repertoire. The next deck that I would actually suggest, and this is more so over price point than anything, I think it's just more accessible, is the Miss Cleo's deck. The reason for this is because you can find the deck for $5 on Amazon or eBay, and so it's nice for the pocket. And the images copy the Rider-Waite. So this is the back of the deck. and this is the beginning. I'm mostly picking this deck because of price point. I think it's accessible, and I do think that you can learn the tarot if you are having, if you're trying to budget or whatever and you just can't afford to pay out for a Rider-Waite, you can learn it with this. The images, in my opinion, are a bit more layman in terms of they're a lot simpler and they're a little bit more cartoony. However, it takes the most important things and the most important symbols out of the Rider-Waite, and it puts in this deck. So you will be able to learn the tarot with this deck if you need to. And again, it's $5 and you can't beat that. $5 on Amazon, $5 on eBay. It's the Miss Cleo's, what is it called again? Miss Cleo Tarot Power Deck. And I'll show you guys a few more, just so you can get a feel for what it looks like and if you feel like it would be something that you would be into looking at. But again, like I said, it has a lot of the same symbolism and the imagery that you would find in a Rider-Waite, and it's super cheap. So if you're trying to learn tarot on a dime, then this will help you do that. Another deck that I would suggest is a Druidcraft Tarot deck. Now, the reason why I would choose this deck is because, in my opinion, it directly copies the Rider-Waite deck, okay? And on top of that, the cards are bigger. So just to give you an idea of a regular deck of cards compared to this deck of cards, here's your regular deck of cards, and then this is this deck of cards. I find that this can be really helpful in the sense that it's so big that it almost functions like a flashcard, right? So I've noticed that when people are learning for tarot in the beginning, there's a lot of this that happens, right? A lot of kind of really looking at the cards, scrutinizing it, trying to find like all the pictures that are in it, all the little symbols that are in it, trying to find the colors. There's a lot of this. I find that when you're learning, if you can have a bigger version of what you're looking at, it's easy for you to find things that are meant to stick out, right? Also, I do find that this deck is a copy of the Rider-Waite. It shares a lot of the same symbolism. I also feel like that people whose intuitive ability is naturally developed would also have a really good time with this deck as well. It's also, you know, a little different aesthetically. Some people may appreciate it, so I figured I'd pull it out. But I do think it's a very good beginner's tarot deck. I said this as someone that when I commit to restudying the tarot, it's one thing about knowing how to read it. When you know how to read it, you know how to read it. But I do think it's important to always study it, to make studying tarot to be kind of like a lifelong commitment, because you learn more as you go and your level of introspection gets deeper as you go throughout the process. And I find that this is one of the decks that I actually tend to turn to when I'm back in my study tarot mode. And so I do think it could be something that could be really helpful. So again, this is the back. We'll give you a few more fronts so you get an idea of what you're looking at here. And the World card. So this is the imagery of this deck. I think this is a really, really good beginner's tarot deck. All right, so the other deck that I have, the next two decks that I have are decks that have keywords in them. When I learned tarot, I did not like decks with keywords because I found that a lot of decks with keywords, the keywords do not match from deck to deck to deck. So if you're learning tarot, it can potentially mess you up because you could potentially be getting the wrong definition. Or a definition of the card that's not widely used, right? So I didn't personally like it. I stayed clear away from it. But I did notice other people that would learn it really needed that help. They really needed that kind of that keyword to help trigger the memory of what the actual definition of the word is. So I have a few that I'll represent, or that I will, what's the word? Recommend. There we go. So one of them is this deck called the Secret of Tarot deck. Now, the reason why I'm recommending this deck is because it's very cheap. It is $5, depending on where you get it from. Some stores, you can get it for literally $5. That was how much I brought it for, and I thought it was a great buy. There are some places that I've seen, maybe on Amazon or eBay, that I've seen charge upwards of $30 to $40 for this deck. I do not think this deck is worth it at that price point. If you're willing to fork out that much money for a tarot deck, then you need to go and buy the Rider-Waite Smith deck, because that is the deck that you need to understand all decks, right? But the reason why I'm recommending it is, one, because it's cheap, and then two, because it actually copies the Rider-Waite. It mimics a lot of the Rider-Waite imagery. Let you guys see it. So if you can find it for that low price point, I say go for it. My two concerns about this deck though, and this is just something to keep in mind, you'll know if this deck is right for you depending on what your tendencies are, right? One thing is that the deck has very poor quality cardstock, so it isn't necessarily as durable. Some people take very good care of their deck of cards. They wrap them up really pretty. They keep them in pouches. If you're that type of person, then it really doesn't matter. I think the cardstock is fine for you. If you're the type of person that kind of tosses your deck around, maybe you carry it in your bag or your purse or whatever, then probably not this deck, because it'll get really beat up. Another thing that I want to flag, so you can err on the side of caution with this one, is to take the keywords at the bottom with a grain of salt, okay? Some of the keywords on this deck are really, 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 really good. Some of the keywords on this deck is not that it's bad. It's back to what I'm talking about before. When you're learning tarot, I don't want you to be susceptible to other people's interpretation if it may mess up your own personal interpretation. So with this deck, if you feel like a card comes out and you know immediately what that meaning means for you, keep it. Don't change the meaning based off of these particular keywords, because it may mess up your whole reading. But again, if you're someone whose funds are limited, for $5, I think it's a fine deck to start with. If anything, just ignore the words on the bottom and use the imagery, because the imagery copies a lot of what's coming out of the Rider-Waite. And last but not least, I would say, and I may get a little bit of flack for this, but a good deck to use if you're a beginner is the Angel Tarot cards. The reason why I think I may get flack for this is because it's got Doreen Virtue on it, and our spiritual community is not messing with Doreen Virtue. The reason why I'm bringing it up though is all Doreen Virtue and Radleigh Valentine cards are now removing Doreen Virtue's name on it, and it's now just Radleigh Valentine, and we still got to support Radleigh because he had nothing to do with this. I just happen to have an older print of this version, so her name is still on my deck of cards. But the reason why I'm suggesting this deck is, one, it is a softer deck in terms of energy and feel. It's very nurturing. It's helpful for when you're learning the cards. Another reason why I'm suggesting this, and I will show you, is because it has definition after definition after definition, and you can only see the light on it, and keyword after keyword after keyword on it. And going through these cards and reading these cards, I actually feel like these keywords are relatively accurate. And I think they're really good for you for when you're learning how to read. Another thing that I've noticed about this card that I think could be helpful is that instead of being labeled, for example, cups, it's labeled with the actual element itself. So cups are water, right? And this particular deck, instead of saying cups, it says water. And so I think if you learn with this deck, while not only learning the definitions itself, you'll be learning the corresponding elements that go with it. And I think that can be really helpful. It's also different kind of aesthetically. It's actually a deck that a lot of tarot readers kind of have in their arsenal. They have one of the versions. There's a few versions of these. There's the Angel tarot deck. There's also another one called the Archangel tarot deck. There's a couple versions of these, but I've noticed that readers tend to have this one of the versions somewhere in their arsenal somewhere, and the definitions on the bottom are really good. So if you feel like you're someone that needs a little help and a little bit of prompting, I would suggest these cards because the definitions are at the bottom of it. Another thing I would suggest, and then if your bank account is set up that way, is if you're leaning towards this particular deck or a deck that's similar to this, that you also consider getting the Rider-Waite as well to go with it for a number of reasons. One, these particular decks don't have traditional imagery. And so you may get messed up with the imagery when you actually are given a deck with traditional imagery, because most decks do have the traditional imagery in it. Also, I think it'd be really good to be able to learn the definitions alongside the actual card that the definition was actually founded off of, right? On top of that, This is another card I'll show you. I think it would be really good to learn the suit of cards and everything that goes with the suits along with the element that it corresponds to. So what I'm saying is that if you're trying to learn a card or a meaning of the card, you have this card in this deck, you pick the same corresponding in the card in the Rider deck, and you can see how they link up. And now mind you, this is so not, I feel like I should probably, for the sake of continuity, pick two cards that are actually the same, but I also don't know how long that's going to take and how much editing that we're going to have to do. I'm just going to have to speed this video up. Okay, hold on. Ah! Boom! All right, so Nine of Earth, Nine of Pentacles, because this is what this card is trying to represent. And the best thing that you could do is compare them side by side. And the reason for that, you understand why this is the element and why the element corresponds to the pentacles, right? You can read the definitions together. And I find that these definitions do work really, really well with the Rider-Waite. And then you can take the definition and look at the imagery of the Rider-Waite and understand where this meaning is actually coming from, right? So that's my tip if you're into cards that do have meanings on the bottom, is to have a Rider-Waite somewhere around you in order to be able to figure that out. But my personal opinion is that the Rider-Waite would be my #1 suggestion for anyone that's just dipping their toes in. And if you find the Rider-Waite difficult, because a lot of people do, because the Rider-Waite is old and it is very traditional, then pair the Rider-Waite with something that's a bit more like this with the definition on it, because at the end of the day, the majority of decks that are produced these days are based off of the Rider-Waite. And if you can't read the Rider-Waite, then it's going to be harder for you to learn to read tarot. It does not mean that you won't be able to read tarot or that you won't be able to be really, really good at it. But you will probably miss certain symbols or imagery and different things like that that are probably really important for your growth down the line. So that would be my suggestion to you. So I hope that this video is helpful. As always, if you like what you see, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys soon.